Namaste. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today we will continue part 4 on spiritual life, and we will begin with the several questions received from our viewers about different paths and teachers. And then we return to the theme of the psychic, continuing from the last time. My name is Alina, and together with Joel, we will host this live streaming. Namaste, Joel.
Namaste, Alina.
Namaste, Sraddhalu, and welcome.
Namaste. Happy to be here.
We are happy to be back, and we thank all our viewers for watching the stream online session with us. Today, I will begin with a few single questions received from our viewers, and then we will continue on the topic of the psychic being. First, we have one message from Alok. Alok is writing, in one of his talks, Sraddhalu spoke about the end of Abrahamic religions. He referred to a Christian prophecy that the current Pope would be the last. Also, it is observed that the days of organized religions are going to be over. How is it going to influence the world order? How will the end of religions affect the world? This is from a past video you have uploaded, and I think it's a good question to start.
In a prior discussion, I had spoken about different traditions which are prophesying as if their own end. And in the Christian tradition, there was a pope who was known to be very mystical, who had written down, as if seeing in form of a prophecy or vision, all the future popes to come. The names that he wrote for each were supposed to be symbolic. I do not remember now the exact number, more than 100 popes. And many of those apparently as a symbol have been right. And the present pope is supposed to be the last in the series, after which implied is that there are no further popes, or at least the prophetic vision could not see further. Similarly, in a certain lineage of mystical Islam, in a Sufi tradition, there is a famous prophecy where the mystic says that 1,000 years from now, and this is 1,000 years ago that he says this, when man steps on the moon, Islam will rise to its highest, and then it will fade away. There is a similar idea in some of the Indian traditions that there is a time when a Kalki avatar comes, and it's as if the series of the avatars, which are supposed to be 10, they just end. There are no further avatars, at least that's how it seems. This idea that the kind of an end comes, and after which either there is some sudden change, return of Christ, return of Imam Mahdi, or the 10th avatar, after which there is a complete shift, a complete change. This idea is suggestive of a radical change beyond which they could not foresee. In the Mayan tradition, we have similarly the famous dating, which came to 2012, as the end of a cycle. And then obviously implied is the beginning of a new cycle. But this was interpreted by many to mean end of the world. And in the sessions I used to have before 2012, I would tell everybody, don't worry, 2012, December 21st, will be just another beautiful day and life continues. And of course, that's how it has been. But this is just to say that the prophecies are only suggestive. Last time I had mentioned how the mother spoke of a certain transition which has already happened, she says, what those prophecies intended. All this is to give a background of the popes and the end of the religious forms, or at least the supremacy of religions. What's the problem with religions as we see today? There is a large formed belief system, often defined by a clergy, supposedly ascribed to an originator, but frozen in time because of a book or an institution which needs to live by certain fixed ideas. And that is then imposed on a group, ideally on all of humanity, as they would foresee it to be or want it to be. This obviously has serious problems because it suffocates the individual needs of each individual to grow along the line of their swabhava, their natural temperament, and their natural line of spiritual evolution. We see it this way from the more dharmic traditions, and by dharmic traditions, the traditions which accept that there are many paths or many approaches to the divine, largely centered within India. But from the other side, the Abrahamic traditions, this idea that each one can follow their own path is unbelievable, unacceptable. There has to be a monotone. And this is where the problem starts. The moment a system says, I alone am right, all others are wrong, then it gets into trouble because the truth is not one-sided. This is all to say that the direction in which these fixed religions have always gone is inevitably time-bound. Swami Vivekananda describes the end of religions in this way. Each religion will tend to divide itself to distinguish specific aspects which are necessary for a different group of people. And each group then further subdivides until eventually each person ends up with their own religion, and that becomes spirituality. It's a very interesting way of looking at it. So the days of organized religions are over. It's already late even for people to want to fit into a box of this kind. It's a mental box, really. How is it going to influence the world order? Well, very simply, more and more people are thinking, feeling, and pursuing a practice which is more and more specific to their need. And if you combine it with our earlier discussions on the subjective age, there is a subjectivism innate to this whole effort. Even within the religious traditions, as you see numbers of followers declining and institutions weakening, they work harder to impose their influence. So that struggle inevitably has to go a certain direction. How does the end of religions affect the world? I'm not sure it will really take that form. I don't think you will have one day people saying, oh, now all religions are ended. Instead, what will happen is the religions themselves will either tend to break up, weaken, or will eventually adapt to this need. And within the religious tradition itself, there will be a recognition of special needs for different people. And they will tend to become less rigid, more soft, more embracing and accepting of variations. And what you will see is groups of people using the name of a religion, but still following largely their own line of development, which is what I see happening, for example, in the West, where a lot of people earlier used to introduce themselves as, I am a recovering Catholic, meaning I went through a period of great distress following the church narrow form of teaching, broke out of it, found my own direction, so to say, and then whatever it is they did. But what you see now more and more is people turning to a form of a mystical Christianity, which would be the core teaching quite different from the church's fixed form, a core teaching which is more living and more real, which may still view Christ or certain elements of the Christianity as necessary, but the forms of it would become much more flexible and adaptive. I see a similar movement among all the Sufi teachers and followers that I have met over the last decade or so. And I found a similar idea there that each Sufi lineage recognized a certain universality in the teaching, and yet each lineage had its own special facet, some emphasizing the devotional, some emphasizing the knowledge, some emphasizing the works aspect. And you will see they all tend to fall into the broad categories, which are the different systems of yoga in any case. So what I see is a blending taking place where yoga knowledge and the core spiritual approaches and principles filling into formal religious structures, softening them, or even creating distinct subgroups and rigid structures breaking down, but then acquiring this softer forms. It's moving from both directions, a kind of an osmosis mix. So I don't think it will end in a radical shift. Just as today you might look at certain religious orders as being too closed, too rigid, and yet you have practitioners bound in those, and maybe numbers are in a few hundred, and maybe they may fade out also, or a few may remain holding on to some idea which is very distinctive, which is what allows for that particular extreme form to still exist. So I do believe we will have many such religious subgroups, or at least in name there would be those groups. I see it more as a transition fading out. You can go to the next.
Okay. Rohan wrote us a beautiful letter saying, there have been many Western neo-spiritual channels and websites that have cropped up lately, where the content creators, authors, claim to be extraterrestrials, entities, or star seeds which identify themselves as non-human types and confidently acknowledge their real place of dwelling in other planets such as Venus, Andromeda, Pleiades, Arcturia, etc. I have been fascinated by their content because although the language and terminologies that they use are cryptic, the gist of their teachings and message is very spiritual and positive and confirmed with the reality on the material plane. My question is that as a Sanatani and a disciple of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, how do I reconcile with such an appealing source of knowledge? They talk about transition from 3D to 5D, which is more like stationing one's consciousness from vital body to higher mind and higher ranges. And there's much more knowledge. Please guide us the truth behind such people who identify themselves as extraterrestrial. It's a very controversial subject. And
fascinating, because there's a kind of a seductive attraction to this idea of extraterrestrials teaching you maybe something about reality or even spirituality. I have looked at many of these over the years, and I found a common pattern among all of them, which is, I think one of the points Rohan makes, that they often use a terminology which is cryptic, but they play with what will bring a greater following. And some of them claim to be channeling an extraterrestrial being, which is as good as any other channeler because you can never verify. Others claim to be themselves extraterrestrial. So I have a very simple response to that. How does it change the value of the teaching, whether you claim to be from another planet or from the Earth? If you claim to be a Martian, or that's not so interesting. Andromeda, Pleiades, these are more interesting. Yes. ideas. So if you have come from the Pleiades, let's say, how does it change the value of what you teach? If an earthling were to go to Pleiades with his current ignorance and claim to be from Earth and say, so I'm bringing superior knowledge than you have, would that be true? Why is it not possible that a Pleiadian could be also ignorant or having exactly the same issues as an earthling with ignorance and then claim to be special? So my point is, first, where they come from makes no difference to the value of the teaching. You have to assess the value of the teaching in itself, independent of what is claimed. Second, if they were actually from some other civilization with some superior knowledge, why don't they give you the superior knowledge or evidence it in a way that will fundamentally change Earth's life? For example, reveal the technology by which we can acquire free energy. If they did that, because they're supposed to have that, if they did that, that would be evidence that they're bringing something of greater value, at least technologically, may not be still spiritually. But if they were actually from another planet and could prove it, the first thing that would happen is the intelligence agencies would kidnap them and put them under experimentation. So again, I don't believe any of them are actually from some other planet. Straight away, I would reject that claim itself. While I don't say it's not possible, certainly it is possible. But then the value of the teaching has to be seen in itself, not because of their claim of where they come from. Then look at the teaching itself. The message, as you say, is very spiritual and positive, necessarily. Otherwise, you can't have a following. Think of it from the perspective of an individual who wants to build a cult following. Can they give a negative message? Nobody is going to last very long as a follower. So it has to be positive. Can there be a non-spiritual message? They know the age is looking for its deeper spiritual truths. So they fit into the mold required for the age. Feed in the kind of information that sounds right or which is currently fashionable in the new age circles. But if you watch them long enough, after a few years, when the fashion changes, either they adapt to the new fashion or they die off. They don't stay for long as a movement. It's interesting. And the moment you see them adapting to a fashion, you know that what they bring is not of any lasting value. Third, look at the core message. Of course, all of them will say things like, you should do good. Some of them will say you should do more good than bad and whatever. But is morality or spirituality? What is the spiritual content of the message? What is the spiritual practice even required? Or the goal of the practice? Is it self-realization or attaining to the direct experience of the divine? If not, they're as good as any other human-made New Age movements. Again, no special value there. And then if they need to claim to be Arcturian just to build a following, then I will say, well, that discounts real value for me. If the message does not have intrinsic value and you have to create fancy propaganda, then I would question the value of the message itself. And finally, is the teaching one of manifesting spirituality in life, which is life transforming, or merely passing through life and waiting to be elevated into some fourth dimension, fifth dimension, third vibration, sixth vibration, or whatever it is, their term for some extra physical reality, heaven-like of the religions, but now they don't use heaven. They create whatever vibrational or dimensional change, in which suddenly you will be taken up and elevated and all the bad people would be removed and you live in a beatific heavenly state. Isn't that the same old story of the religious promises, now coming in a different packaging, which is more scientific sounding? And if that's all their message is, then I'm sorry, it has no value at all. You can see how there's a repackaging of terminology, but nothing fundamentally new. Unfortunately, everything that I have seen so far is of this kind. The questioner, Rohan, says they talk of 3D to 5D, which is more like stationing one's consciousness in the vital body and mind and higher ranges. Well, that's how you interpreted it. Look at the literature in precision. What is meant by that 4D or 5D? Read the description carefully. Does it actually correspond to higher mind or illumined mind or intuitive mind? Not really. All they describe is a higher state of vibration into which you are elevated if you live by whatever life you're required to, and often it is done automatically. There'll be a galactic alignment, certain frequencies will come, certain waves of energy will come, and you will be elevated on such and such a date, or whatever the teaching is. It's not one of growth of consciousness, really. And all of these are clear markers that it's just another reconstruction. Maybe the person preaching may be genuine in intention and maybe misled by some channeled knowledge or inspired knowledge. I don't know. But in practice, I have not found anything to be truly worthwhile. Yes, some of them do have interesting insights. Some of them go into stories about the past of things that happened on Earth 1,000,000 years ago or 2,000,000. Maybe true, may not be, you have no way of verifying. Some of them will tell you stories of Atlantis, could be total fantasy, no way of verifying. But unless it has a practical value in transforming consciousness, I would not find it worthwhile to spend too much energy in those. I have, and I can see this having done it long enough, that I didn't find anything truly worthwhile so far.
Okay, maybe we can move to another few questions which received from our viewers with the same topic. So Harshit writing, can one have multiple gurus on the path? Like, I feel inclined towards X or and the mother. How to find one's own guru? Another question related from Rohit. What do you think about the popular mystics in India like X and such? Do you think they are helping the mass and the current world situation? Amit is writing, people like Ken Wilber are digesting and then offering Sri Aurobindo's thoughts as their own, sometimes with distortions, and then criticizing Sri Aurobindo. How can this be prevented?
Okay. So all three questions deal with different paths, different popular movements, and differences or conflicts between them. And so I cluster them together generally, but I'll take up the aspects of the questions as we go along. The first question up from Harshit is, can one have multiple gurus on this path, meaning the integral yoga? The answer I will say is, depends on your definition of guru. What do you understand by that word? If by guru you mean somebody who's giving out useful knowledge, helpful suggestions, guidelines, insights, yes, of course, you can have multiple teachers. I'll use the word generally. But if by guru you mean somebody who has a direct spiritual living knowledge and experience of the goal which is sought, and is able to transmit it to you and assist you actively in the path, then you can't have two or more. You see, fundamentally, the two different people living the same experience would not happen. Or let's say they're in the same path with the same values, that might happen, but then they would not be gurus. They would be each representatives of a certain teaching. So I will draw from the Sanskrit vocabulary using several words for the word teacher in English. We have in Sanskrit the word shikshak. Shikshak is somebody who gives lessons, shiksha. So you go to, let's say, class 10, the maths teacher comes, writes down something on the board, gives you a lesson. He knows what he's talking about, or if he's a history teacher, He doesn't even know what he's talking about. He's repeating what he has learned, reading a book to pass an exam. Okay, but he gives you a lesson and makes sure you learn the same lesson that he learned, and it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Unfortunately, this is the case for most of the teachers in all branches of knowledge. Even if it's maths, they often don't know, they just repeat what's in the book. What I mean by no is really no. For example, when a teacher tells you 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, you repeat, you pass an exam. But you could ask the teacher, why is 1 plus 1 equals to 2 and not 3? So you could of course say, it's obvious, are you a fool? Why are you asking such a silly question? But if you enter the mathematics truly, there's an entire, perhaps book-sized dissertation demonstrating why 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, or what would happen if it was not equal to 2. It's one of those fundamental things of reality. And can you conceive of a universe where 1 plus 1 is something else? Or, put it another way, if you take 1 plus 2 is equal to 3, 2 plus 1 should be equal to, and you'll say, of course, it's 3. No, not necessarily. It's not obvious. There are mathematics where A plus B is different from B plus A. And it's a whole different world, especially when you're dealing with infinities. For example, if you say 1 plus infinity is equal to the infinite. But infinity plus 1, it's a different order of infinity. Okay, so it's a whole different domain of mathematics. And the teacher who's telling you what A plus B should be B plus A does not know. Is beyond his competence, perhaps. This is just to say that teachers or a shikshak does not need to be master of the knowledge that they give a lesson from. Okay. The second type is adhyapaka, is a term used in Sanskrit, is somebody who, so to say, handholds you through a process, not just giving you a lesson and then say, do it. He handholds you. So he leads you through a practice. Let's say you're practicing asanas. The person does the asanas with you and shows you by doing. I've seen yoga teachers who will sit on a chair with a very, let's say, unhealthy body, who will tell the students, okay, now you do this, now you do that. If the student asks, do I do it this way or the other? He will say, look up on the internet. Yes, there are such teachers also. But adhyapaka is one who goes, this would be a shikshak. Adhyapaka is one who actually practices and does it with you. But he doesn't need to be of a higher standard. Pandit is another term which is used to describe somebody who has a lot of knowledge. Acharya is even greater. Somebody who demonstrates by example what you should become, necessarily of a higher grade than you. So a lot of great teachers would be in the category of Acharya. Some of them would be Pandit with great knowledge, not necessarily demonstrating the practice themselves. But Acharya lives it. And if you have a contact with somebody of that grade, well, just the contact helps you, inspires you, and assists. But he need not be a perfect representative of the teaching. He may be a representative of what it's like to be on the path, and that's about it. A guru is of a completely different grade. The guru, first of all, has to live the teaching, and of a certain order that you can actually say, ah yes, at least that approaches the goal of the teaching. And more important, he enters in a relationship with you where he takes responsibility for your journey. Not only hand-holding, not only being an example, but actually lifting and carrying you and pushing you where necessary. To be able to do that, he must be already of a certain foundation and grounded in a foundation on a higher level that he can pull you or push you, lift you, or reach into you and remove a distortion, remove a veil, or insert an experience, imprint an experience, awaken something. These are direct interventions by which your ignorance is removed and you're lifted or carried in the path. How many do you know who do that? When you look at these, we have used the word multiple gurus. How many do you actually know who can do that? And I'm going to give a few examples here. I will avoid taking names, but I want to describe certain patterns, let's say, of behavior, primarily because it's important for us to be able to distinguish. It does not help to be politically correct and say each one is doing their own good work. Yes, of course, that's true in a general way. But we need to distinguish what is the nature of the good work and where it falls short. And so I want to give a few examples without necessarily taking names, or I will take a few names only where it concerns an appreciation. So think about this role of a guru, truly what that means. If you were to meet such a guru who is capable in their path, whatever that lineage or that path is, of doing this, would he accept you as a disciple? If he were to accept more than a certain number of disciples, would he be able to pay attention enough to look after them? Think about what that means. Let's say you have that capacity to help people intervene in their consciousness, change and lift them. How many people do you think you could take on with that responsibility? You cannot have 1,000,000 followers because you don't have the time or the energy to manage 1,000,000. And here I will take the example, a positive example of one of the persons I genuinely, deeply respect and admire as a spiritual guru and teacher, although he may not use that word. And I mentioned before in some of the talks, somebody by the name of Llewellyn Vaughan Lee. He's a teacher in a Sufi lineage based in the US. And it's worth it for you to see some of his writings and his website. Deeply inspiring. And in one of the conversations that I had with him, he said to me something like he has about 700 or 800 students. And that's it. He says, I can't manage more. He takes students only when guided or when he sees a certain responsibility. And if the student does not live up to the demand of the path, he simply says, look, I don't have time to give you. You have to leave if you cannot make this little effort. But to those who he has taken on, he will intervene actively in a way that when the student meets, or sometimes even without them meeting physically, the student will receive a message saying, you are not doing this, this is your lack, this is the difficulty, you must work to overcome this. Or they receive an active help where he appears in various forms, sometimes in the dream or even through a message saying, giving a nudge or a push. But numbers, not possible to go beyond 700, 800. Maybe another 100 or 2 you could add. But 1,000 is already such a huge burden if you are actively looking after all these disciples, spiritually responsible for them. So the moment you see somebody who is presented as a guru with a very large number of followers, well, they don't really come in that category of the strict definition of guru. They don't take responsibility for their disciples. They may not even know their followers. And I won't use the word disciple anymore. So at that point, they may drop in my listing from guru to perhaps acharya. So they set an example. They say, here, do this. You're inspired, you follow or not. But it's not a guru then. Of course, the word guru is largely today misused, loosely used. There used to be a website some 10 years ago which offered gurus of various types, gurus for teaching mathematics, gurus for teaching artificial intelligence, guru for any scientific or technological knowledge. Yeah, that's not guru. That's shikshak perhaps, adhyapaka perhaps, even pandit perhaps, but not guru. So if you use the word strictly, then you will not find too many. And most of them who are there will avoid publicity like plague for this very reason. Because you cannot really manage a large number of disciples. You can't take so much responsibility. It's physically not possible. If you remember, even in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, from the early days, the number of disciples that Sri Aurobindo had were in a few dozen. It grew to be 200, which is quite a large community from a spiritual point of view, for a concentrated spiritual practice. And only much later in the 40s, The numbers grew with the coming of so many refugees, but they did not come as disciples. They came as devotees. They came as people with devotion, not really dedicating to the sadhana and the practice of the yoga. The mother accepted them because she was the mother. She said, I can't send them away, they're my children. So, and then there was a distinction of the concentrated practitioners of the sadhana and then the others who were merely devotees. And what does a devotee seek? Well, I give my devotion. I feel good to receive the blessing. I have my darshan. I felt nice. I'm happy to just feel nice. But don't ask me to do much. So what you will see in many of these large popular movements, a lot of followers, devotees, but rarely disciples. Or the discipline is simplified. Here is an XYZ branded name practice. Do this every day. Often they involve some form of pranayam, which is modified to be more distinctive to, let's say, that particular group, because you have to brand yourself with a USP. And then you follow that, you spend your 5-10 minutes doing their fixed practice, and that's it. What else is required of you? Well, you offer your devotion to the Guru, you send the money to the institution, that's about it. So spiritually, that could have limited value or even no value. So comes down to the point of what is the path itself aiming at? Are these aiming at a spiritual realization? Most of them are not. They aim at a moral change, self-improvement, bit of ethical improvement, do good, change society, clean up the roads, clean up the rivers, speak of friendship and harmony between religions. But what do you do actively in terms of spiritual change? If the teacher were to demand a spiritual effort from the practitioners, your 1,000,000 followers would drop overnight to a few thousand. Because most people are not interested in making a spiritual effort. I give an example. This is somebody I had met when I was traveling in the UK, and met through a common friend. The person said, my guru is, and he named somebody at that time who was living at the time and who was known for miracles. So he had his photo. He would offer every day his flowers, do his prayers. But if you asked him, what does your guru ask you to do? Nothing. That person was known to perform miracles and to grant wishes, or at least that's what he thought. So his guru was somebody who would give him what he wanted or grant his wishes. And then he said very proudly, I'm so glad I have a living guru. But he had never even met his guru. Guru doesn't know him. Well, it's not a relationship of guru. It's a relationship of adoration, devotion to somebody who makes him feel good, or some teaching that makes him feel good. And that's it. And that's useful. So coming back to this question, can one have multiple gurus on this path? You can have many teachers, you have many sources of inspiration, but there is only one guru. In this path, the guru is the one who founds the path. Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Even I'm going to push it a step further, and we'll come to that, with the true sense of guru. The ultimate guru will be the divine. And then we will see what the relationship is with that. But I'll keep that for the last part of the discussion. Yes, you can have multiple sources of inspiration and of learning, but be careful. Be careful. If you recall some of the discussions we have had before on the conflicting values of an ascetic path versus an affirmative path, you will end up with a lot of confusion. And as I've said to you before, this confusion exists among people living at the Sri Aurobindo ashram. This confusion exists among people who have read Sri Aurobindo's writings and are speaking about them, but in the mind's mold are still ascetically formed. They end up speaking things which are still ascetic values, not realizing that they're trying to mix totally contradictory values. I'll give an example. I see a lot of stories are told about somebody who's traveling very in high fever, or does not have food, and then somebody appears, gives him food and vanishes, and they cannot trace who the person was. It was the teacher who incarnated, or the God who incarnated in some form and gave help, etc. This is projected as a great event in the person's life, and certainly it's a great event of any divine intervention's help. But what's the message? Implied in that message is God will provide you whatever you need. You're hungry, have faith, He will come and give you the food. If he has not given you the food, then well, you are not yet of a high spiritual stage. That person who was so great got God's intervention, who gave him food, cured his fever. Implied somewhere is this idea that you be passive, have faith, God will do everything. The fact that this story is promoted greatly as a great thing is sending a message of passivity. One of the persons in the ashram, I have mentioned this before, published in their journal, which was supposed to be translations of Mother and Sri Aurobindo's writings, they published a story of this great elephant who had golden tusks and who, out of compassion, gave a piece of his tusk to a woodcutter who was very poor. And the woodcutter comes back and says, now I need more, and he keeps on cutting the tusk until eventually he extracts the whole tusk and the elephant dies bleeding. And the story ends with all the gods showering petals on the elephant and saying, oh, you are so great, you will come into heaven. I heard this story read out because somebody found it moving and narrated it. And I said, what is this story doing in a space like this? Can you see the message of passivity and inertia and the complete disdain for life and self-sacrifice in stupidity, so that you die in suffering to help someone else and you are praised by the gods and live in heaven? You see the ascetic ideal and its stain, distortion. And we are replete with such stories. And they come from the mouths of people who teach even Sri Aurobindo's writings, without them realizing that there's a fundamental conflict of values. And I'm saying this because when you read from different sources, be very careful of the core message behind what you read. I'm not saying don't read. Please do read. Get inspired. But know also where there's a fundamental conflict of values and priorities. If you read an ascetic source, you will find lots of stories like this. You read from Sri Aurobindo, well, the two don't gel. Are you able to distinguish and extract the nourishment from those stories? If you can, good. Otherwise, be careful. You can have multiple teachers, but be careful where these core values conflict. So yes, if you feel an inclination to read from X and to read from Mother, wonderful. If you find the inspiration from both, wonderful. But I would also ask, maybe neither of them is your guru, at least yet, isn't it? And that's why your second question, how to find one's guru. I wouldn't have a simple answer to that, because I don't think you can find in that way. Of course, that also works sometimes, but more than anything else, one recognizes. There is either a spontaneous recognition of the inner being that knows because it experiences an affinity, an identity, a spontaneous movement of self-giving, of belonging, and of being taken, embraced, held, lifted, protected by the Guru. It happens and it's done. Or not. Or there's a slow growth of recognition, yes, this feels right. And over time, you kind of grow into an affinity and alignment to a certain teaching or to a certain personality. But still, that may not be the Guru. Until that relationship forms where the responsibility is taken by the active presiding power or the individual, it's not yet Guru. It is still you're following a path, and there is a great teacher, even an Acharya there, but that's about it. And maybe your path will change also. I'm tempted to share an example from my mother's experience. When she came to meet the mother, she didn't come because she knew much the first time. She came because, well, her husband brought her, and they were going to go to meet the mother. And her father had already told her, be careful, India is full of lots of not so genuine and even fake spiritual teachers. Don't bow down to anybody blindly just because they wear ochre robes or they seem to be spiritual. So she goes to the mother and she is carrying something to offer, but she's not sure whether this is the one that she should be accepting. And she's, of course, has worshipped all her life to a certain form of Mother Durga. So she is in front of the mother and she says, in her heart, she says, I won't bow down to you just because of this, unless you are that. She asks, are you that? The mother nodded and the sanction was given. In that moment, there was the recognition, the self-giving, and she had brought certain, I think it was tulsi leaves or flowers she offered, and that was it. This communication, recognition, self-giving of the soul is your recognition. Whether it is immediate, as in this experience, in a physical contact, whether it is gradual over time, whether it takes place in a subtle contact and recognition, doesn't matter. Because the Guru is always an active power. Otherwise it cannot be Guru, isn't it? Some people reading the Mother or Sri Aurobindo, just reading, I have no idea, I have not even seen a picture, will feel that connection. I remember this was shared to us by somebody in Auroville, somebody named Gilles, and he was reading Sri Aurobindo's writings while he was in France. Reading the text, there was the soul recognition. This is, and he used the word truth speech, truth forming into speech, and that's it. The recognition was immediate, this is my path, and the rest followed. So I give these examples to show you that the fundamental recognition will come from deep within, from the soul. Until that happens, you may have any number of teachers. When that recognition happens, there will be no question of multiple gurus. You see, there will be the Guru, who will be eventually, of course, the divine, and we'll come to that later. So how to find one's Guru? Well, I will say simply ask the divine to help you, or simply accept the divine as the Guru, and then eventually the form in which the divine expresses to you, if you need that formal support, well, that will come, or that will appear, or you will recognize. It's not so important. And this point about the ultimate Guru, I will come back to. The next question of Rohit about popular mystics in India, whether they help the mass and so on. I will answer first in a very general way and then point out to the form of the help or not. Generally speaking, everybody helps, whether they are conscious of it or not. Even those who seem to oppose the divine will ultimately end up helping. By delaying, they strengthen. I am speaking of asuras here. By delaying and opposing the evolution, they strengthen evolution, they strengthen the ultimate outcome, make it more perfect, and so on. So ultimately, everybody helps. The question, of course, for us is, spiritually, actively, will they help to awaken? Some have a teaching that takes you one step in a particular direction with a certain emphasis. Some don't have a spiritual teaching, and as I said, they have primarily a moral or ethical teaching, and some worship devotional support. and they help for that purpose. But it also happens sometimes that in the form of the teaching there are certain distortions. Now I'm giving an example of a person I met who was drawn to Sri Aurobindo's teaching, met somebody who claimed to have been from the Sri Aurobindo ashram, accepted him as his guru, and this is where you see the danger of that. And the person, of course, had a whole thing around his personality. He wrote poetry, he wrote songs, and he required all his disciples to learn them all by heart and sing them on demand, and all kinds of things, which were his own fancies. But at the end of it did not help in the spiritual evolution. It only led to conflicts and divisions in the person and in their community eventually, which broke away after that person passed on. So there are people who will claim to be representing a teaching because, well, that's what people are looking for, isn't it? I give another example of a person who calls himself Swami something. So in his brochure for his institution, there is a bio of Sri Aurobindo, bio of the mother, and then bio of Swami so-and-so, as if suggesting a lineage. Except this man is wearing ochre robes, calls himself Swami. So how can he be following Sri Aurobindo's teaching? Isn't it? Which is not an ascetic teaching, where there is no initiation into Swamihood or labeling of this kind. Think about it. In the very statement of his name and his claim to authority, he has exposed himself as not representing this. I'm not saying as a fraud. I don't know what he teaches, and I'm not really interested. Maybe he teaches something useful, but he definitely does not teach Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, isn't it? And yet he has to say that because that's what attracts people, because he claims to be teaching Sri Aurobindo's yoga. That gives him an authority. So another example I was told about, I have no contact with the person directly, I only heard the story because someone from Auroville met him. Good man, maybe he has some genuine teachings, but he says, all that all that I had to say, Sri Aurobindo has already said. So read Sri Aurobindo, implied, and then come to me. So the implication is whatever I wanted to say, Sri Aurobindo has said, so I won't waste my time repeating, but go to Sri Aurobindo for that. But then I'm there because I meant to say all that. And that's a joke. That's a joke. Because, well, it's sad. It's sad even that people get carried away listening to this kind of thing. That they cannot distinguish. The person who narrated this to me, I had to tell him, but don't you see the game that's played here? I can understand that somebody appreciates Sri Aurobindo and says, here, read him because there. And maybe they are teachers in their own right and they admire Sri Aurobindo, no problem. But to claim that all that I had to say, Sri Aurobindo has said, means you live in a consciousness of, at the very least, intuitive mind or over mental consciousness? No, that's a pretense, because the person does not. What he does is he materializes objects. That's the joke, you see. His claim to fame is the materialization, and the rest is the marketing. I'm going to give a few more examples like this, and I don't mean to hurt anybody's faith, because the faith you have is always precious. If you break that, well, you have no anchor. And yet, if you do not discriminate, one can easily get carried away in a lot of, I will use the word, populist or politically correct statements. Oh yes, all paths lead to the same eventually, all are good people, all are doing good work. Yes, of course they are. But do they align to this fundamental objective of the integral yoga? And I'm very focused on this. They may align to their own path, their own ascetic lineage, their own ascetic belief or ideal or practice. Wonderful, and they may be perfect for that. But do they align to this? Do they align to spiritual growth? These are the concerns for me. A very good example of a genuine path is Paramahansa Yogananda and the path, the institution he founded as the Self-Realization Fellowship. In the very name of the institution is self-realization as the goal set. The entire practice demanded on their practitioners are steps towards attaining self-realization. Now, for the particular process and the path, which is their way, it's perfect. Their monks are dedicated, deep practitioners, many of them having attained deep and high spiritual states, living in it, and the entire path has a certain spiritual, let's say, framework that is so solidly rooted. And then there is the whole institutional, let's say, structure around it, where over time in the US particularly, they have brought in various deities. They had to bring in a lot of elements of Christianity which were not central to the teaching or to their master's teaching. They created an institutional framework for weddings of their devotees, which is just like a church practice. To me, these are secondary. They are paraphernalia of an organized institution and the organizational structures. The central teaching is the spiritual teaching is rock solid. And that's an excellent path for spiritual purpose. I look at somebody else presently popular in India, and I was there in a public function where he spoke. Before he came on stage, there was a video shown of this person riding a motorcycle, flying a helicopter, playing with children, distributing food packets in some relief operation, in some flooding, etc. And with dramatic music. And when the thing finishes, he walks in with a dramatic music. And I said, if this is his claim to fame, I saw nothing there that was of any spiritual value. So the person is doing excellent social work and to be commended. Redirecting all his funds perhaps to that, to building a following, maybe, that's fine also. That raises more funds to do more social work. But was there a spiritual content to the central message? Not in that presentation. In the discussion that followed, was there a spiritual content to the message? None that I heard. There was a lot of discussion about politics, interesting opinions, sometimes interesting insights, some things that I found to be completely wrong. He claimed that world population is too large, so women should just decide not to have children. And I said, you have no basic understanding of how human instinct works or how nature works. So it was clearly a huge deficit of knowledge in a very clear space. Subsequently, I heard a video of him where he says, in 20 years, the global population should be reduced to half of what it is. Think about the implication. In 20 years, 3 billion people should cease to be. How do you think that will happen? Disease, death, on large scale, you're actively promoting removal of 3 billion people in 20 years. It's not over 100 years or 200 years, you reduce population gradually. It's about 20 years. And the man has not even thought of the implications. So yes, there are very interesting teachings he may give, very interesting writings, interesting ways of presentation, but nowhere I found a depth of spiritual insight or even sometimes practical understanding of some of these things. Are they useful? Yes, of course, because many of the things he speaks are interesting, helpful, and because there's a whole machinery for popularizing. Through it, I've met numerous people who are admirers of his teachings or books and have benefited. Does it have a lasting spiritual value? I don't know. But at least as a small step to people who catch elements that are useful, it's a great help. But know where the lack exists, distinguish, discriminate. Do not consider such a person to be all-knowing or absolutely right in their spiritual advice, because the knowledge they offer does not come from a deeper spiritual foundation or experience, although it is presented in an attractive intellectual way. I give another example of a teacher who became famous because, well, she was a woman and she would embrace people who came to her. They felt good, perhaps. The woman was a saint, for sure. She lived in a consciousness of certain exaltation. I don't know what exactly, I do not have a direct contact, but it was definitely a certain state of exaltation. Then around her grew the paraphernalia. And at that point comes the problem. The paraphernalia needs to be maintained for which you have to raise funds. So they started a whole process of selling clothes she has worn for so many lakhs of rupees. And then there's a whole industry for selling those properties. The money coming in are, of course, used for social work, which is wonderful, and a lot of free hospitals, schools, excellent work socially. Now comes the spiritual part. So I met a few of the disciples who were working there, working very hard to build the institutions. One day they all rebelled. They said it's too much, it's back-breaking work, we don't even get time to rest properly, and much less can we do our spiritual practice. So they went on a revolt. And she came to them and said, do you realize how much bad karma you're burning up by working so hard? And when I heard that story, I said, here is a person who does not really understand. She may live in an exalted state of consciousness, but the knowledge that comes through is not of a higher status. Again, this is to distinguish between a state you may live in, which may be spiritually high, but it does not mean you have the true knowledge. It does not mean your actions are aligned to that state. You see, there's a gap which is common to all ascetic traditions between the outer and the inner. And so the inner may still live in a exalted state, and the outer may throw a curse, as we have heard stories of rishis who would get angry easily and curse, and then regret. Once the impulse of anger passed, they would regret and then offer a counter support. But this gap allows for expression of forms that do not represent even the state they live in, much less a higher state, which would be our goal eventually. And so recognize the value that the person holds because she lives in a state, she perhaps shares it or perhaps transmits it to people who come to her. But that's where the spiritual value stops. All the rest is paraphernalia that may have social value, and that's about it. Know the strengths, but know the limitations also. I have another person that comes to mind, building a movement, very popular. And they have this multiple level marketing today, which is the standard process now for everybody who wants to become famous. But all of this ends with one question: for what? What is his central teaching? And I asked this around, I could find nothing. There were commentaries on various spiritual texts from the Indian tradition ascribed to his authorship, certain practices which were given, but what's the goal spiritually? And there was never any clear message there. And I say, well, then it has social value, but it's not obviously, it does not have an obvious spiritual value, at least for the followers. Maybe there's a core group, I don't know. But in the masses, at least, it does not have spiritual value. I think this is broadly answering the question. And I've taken these examples because there'll be many more. And I'm thinking of the world 20 years from now, or 50 years from now. I hope these observations will be helpful for you to help distinguish between what serves a higher spiritual purpose or what serves as intermediate steps. And everybody serves intermediate steps wherever they try to do good. Miracles are not a reference for spirituality. Social work are not a reference for spirituality. Political connections are not. Again, this is an example of an ashram I've been to, where you enter the reception and on the wall are photographs of their head meeting XYZ political leaders. And I said to myself, if that's the claim to fame, well, it does not have a spiritual priority at least. It shows political influence, but that's about it. Fame or number of followers also are not a reference. You can be famous, does not mean that it's spiritually developed. You can have numbers of followers, not a measure of spiritual development. So here's an example. One of my friends was in a discussion, interfaith discussion, and somebody said in that discussion, he was a Christian, he said, look at the greatness of the truth that Christ has brought. There's so many, 1 billion followers. So my friend who was on the other side of the discussion, he said, does that mean when Christ taught and had only 12 disciples, the truth was lesser? And as the number of disciples grew, the truth has grown by 100 million fold? That means it was a lesser truth when he taught? And the other person was taken aback. If numbers of followers are a measure of the value of the truth, then, well, when the person starts teaching, you have very small numbers of followers, isn't it? And the truth has certainly not grown in time. So discount number of followers, it just means the person is charismatic or has good marketing. Fame similarly does not mean much. You see, today I've seen a lot of wealthy people. They need to have a sense of association with spirituality. And what do? They look around, who's the most famous, what's the biggest name, and they align to that. And then either become donors or participants. And then it's in their social circles, they will say, oh, I'm follower of X. And it gives them a greater prestige spiritually because it's a famous spiritual head. If they had said, oh, my spiritual teacher is living in a forest, you don't even know his name, nobody knows, he just hides. Well, that's a different kind of fame. My teacher is so great, he is unknown to anybody. He is actually totally secret. But what is his speciality? Well, he grants wishes or he performs miracles, whatever it is. You would not feel excited about speaking of somebody who is relatively unknown unless you had a real affinity. And I have met people like that also. They have a genuine affinity with somebody about whom you have never heard. But then you will see in those people there is a dedicated practice of some kind and a really strong commitment to the practice. The value of it I don't know, but the commitment is there. And the commitment can last only if there is some benefit they have had. So I'm giving these as examples and references. Again, living or dead guru, the physical body is not a reference. You can be living and you can be on the other side of the world. If there is not an energetic or spiritual contact, it's not a guru. Right? It's as good as dead. You can have left the body and still be active, and you can experience a direct spiritual contact, and it's a living guru, isn't it? So these are some points I wanted to convey. So as general comments now, make a distinction on the goal of the path before you decide whether this is your path. What is the goal that is sought? Be clear about that. Before you mix, let's say, practices or knowledge from different traditions, consider what the goal is and understand the value of the practice in terms of the goal. You may adopt a practice from a different path, but recognize how it served that path, and in your modification of the practice, how you're serving a different goal. Because certain practices are common. For example, deep breathing practices as a way of calming the mind. Certain practices of concentration would be common to practically any path, even religious traditions. But what do you do with that? What do you aim at through the calming of the mind? And that may diverge. So first become conscious of distinctions of the goal. Understand the methods of practice in terms of that, and if you're modifying or adapting the practices, make sure that you do not lose the focus of the goal. Recognize also the quality of energy that presides in a path. See, often to have a mass following, the energy has to have a strong, vital, charismatic element. Otherwise, you don't get numbers quickly. I give an example of even in the life of the Buddha. How many actual disciples did he have? If you see actual numbers, during his lifetime, they were relatively small. They grew in number later. Sri Aurobindo, during his lifetime, made sure that numbers did not grow by needless publicity. He even wrote in response to a letter. First, he says numbers, of course, mean nothing for the spiritual change, even for the transformation. But he said, he even wrote there that I do not want publicity, because he said publicity always leads to either a movement or uh, a huge host, a huge horde of useless people coming and spoiling the work. He uses this phrase. And then he says, if there is a movement, every movement either gets a bang or a bust. And I want neither. And then he explains how he wants real change of consciousness and so on. So even numbers of people who came to him as disciples were filtered. They were asked, are you really interested in a path that has these goals? And then only if they showed their commitment and only if Sri Aurobindo accepted, then the person was accepted as a disciple. Of course, that physical process not being there, the point still exists that the acceptance has to be from both sides. So this brings me finally to the theme of what is the Guru really? Who is the Guru? I described what the Guru does. And particularly it's this intervention to remove a hurdle or a veil of ignorance, or to implant, instill, inspire an experience or a state of consciousness or a change of consciousness. Ultimately, where does that come from, that action? Even where there is the human form of a Guru, the consciousness itself that is implanted or inspired, or the action comes from where? If the Guru is still living in an ego-centric consciousness, well, he has not yet reached a state of realization that would be worthy of at least what you seek, isn't it? So he has obviously transcended the ego or dissolved the ego sufficiently that within limits, there's some action of the divine inspiration working through the Guru. And I'm not saying the Guru is perfect. He may have other flaws. He's still in a state of partial development. But still, the action that is coming through is effective because it comes from the divine source passing through him in the part of him that is now relatively transparent, and so acts on you. So who is the Guru really? Where is the action coming from? From the divine. And the divine did not necessarily need this support. The divine can act in you as effectively, directly, isn't it? Finally, it's an action of the spiritual energy. So it doesn't have to pass through a person. It can come directly, and generally does come directly to you, even when you think it's coming from that person. Isn't it? So ultimately, the Guru who intervenes as Guru to remove ignorance or implant a spiritual awakening is the divine. The human form is a point of support, a reflector perhaps, or an embodiment who becomes in human frame a living embodiment of the divine consciousness, of at least the goal that is sought in the path. So leaving aside other paths where the embodiment is not so important, even a reflection is good enough, I come to the integral path, integral yoga, where embodiment is essential because the goal is a divinization of life. The mind, vital, and the physical to be reasonably transformed. I'm not even saying completely transformed. Reasonably transformed, that there is a transparency of the divine action. In which case, again, the question is, where is it coming from? From the divine. Who is the Guru? Isn't it? So my suggestion would be generally to that first question. How does one find one's Guru? I will answer, how do you find the divine? Or rather, put it another way, what is your current relationship with the divine? That's your link to your Guru. Start by opening yourself more and more in that relationship. Start by offering yourself in that relationship. What would you do if you had a physical Guru? It's what you are supposed to do, right? Well, your Guru is already with you. Start by opening and ask for the help. Ask for the guidance. And maybe you won't hear it as a voice, and if you heard it as a voice, don't trust it, generally. But it will come to you in a certain way, either by an intuition or an insight, or something comes your way that you recognize, this was the answer I was looking for. You will know because your inner being is sufficiently awake that it recognizes. If it was not sufficiently awake, your seeking would not be genuine. It would be casual. And a casual seeking, you're happy to read spiritual literature. I do my 10 minutes reading every day. I feel good about it. Doesn't matter what. Give me any book. That's fine. But when there's a real call, the inner being is pushing. That's the source of the call, isn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't feel that call. And it is there that the recognition will take place. Ah, this is the answer I was looking for. And you turn spontaneously in gratitude and say thank you. And in time, the trust builds, the link forms, deepens until increasingly the insight comes in a flash of intuition. And you will learn to trust it. At first, you have to test, you have to discriminate, but you will learn to trust it. And that's your guru. Your guru is already with you. It's a question of what are you doing about your relationship? Think of it in this way. So now I come to what does that mean in our relationship to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. In this particular case, it's relatively easy to articulate this. Sri Aurobindo not only articulated the nature of the spiritual experience, but he embodied it. You will notice the knowledge that he had, it's all there already. It was written in from 1914 onwards in the Arya. He was writing 6 books at a time. But he was waiting. He was waiting to return to the world for action in the world physically until the supramental consciousness had been established in the physical body itself and the body transformed. That was the realization he was waiting for. He got it all the way through the transformation of the mind, the vital, and the subtle physical. But that last part remaining, that next step of returning for action in the world actively had to be well postponed. But in the meanwhile, and that was the advantage of this dual form of their work, the mother was acting constantly while he held the thread, I will say, the pull of the consciousness being fixed into matter. The mother was working, manifesting that through the work that she was doing, and of course all the correspondence that Sri Aurobindo was directly handling, and so on. Because they embodied the ideal that they spoke of, revealed, we recognize in them that. That's why my mother could see in the Divine Mother, in the Mother, yes, this is the one that I have been worshipping. That recognition was possible. So for those of us at least who recognize this, it's obvious for this yoga, they are the Guru. And yes, I can read a lot of literature which helps me to understand, brings clarity and enlarges my knowledge base. No problem, but it does not conflict. I don't have multiple gurus. For those of us who do not see this, who do not feel in Sri Aurobindo and the Mother that they are an embodied form of the realization that is sought in the integral yoga, they are still there as great examples, exemplars, as Acharya to give you the inspiration in the path, in the way, until either you recognize that or it doesn't matter. The form does not matter. Mother actually made this statement in so many words to Huta. She said, after she leaves the body, she said, there is no Sri Aurobindo and Mother, there will be only the truth. If you have the perception of that in them, perhaps it's a help because you have a form through which you can relate. But on the other hand, I've seen so many people who are so fixated on the form that they cannot see the totality of the Divine Mother as an active presence around and within them because they are still fixated on this particular form of the body through which she incarnated here. This is not the same as accepting anybody the divine incarnation. There are people who will say, I have accepted so and so as my guru and for me he is God. Well, that's your projection, fantasy, hope. I won't say faith because it's not the heart's recognition, the soul's recognition. Faith is the soul's recognition. This is more like mental construction. And maybe it helps you for a while. But it's not a truth of the soul seeing. So be careful not to create such false structures. When there's a recognition, it is there. When there is not a direct recognition, there is at least the heart's recognition or the soul's recognition that yes, this is my path, or at least something along these directions, something along these lines, and you start reading, studying, immersing yourself until a greater awakening takes place. So simply put, and in the most general statement, I will say the divine guru is already with you, within you. Work to develop that link. Open yourself more and more in consecration to the sacred presence and the guidance in whatever way aligns with your temperament. For some through the mind, some through the heart, some through the dedicated, consecrated service. If possible, all three, to whatever degree possible. And then gradually the influence of the Guru will grow and begin to fill you and lead you and transform you. To that end, many people may come your way who may help you. Recognize the knowledge that comes or the help that comes as coming from the source, from the divine. And offer gratitude to the divine even as you thank the vehicle or the messenger through whom the help came. But let your primary relationship be always with the divine, directly. And then you won't be deceived by appearances. You will see the divine working through all of them, as I said, including those who oppose. I think it's a good point to pause and we could concentrate on this idea and this bhava, this sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.